actually we'll just jump right in. We're working through church history, and particularly the history of how Christians and the church have interacted with earthly governments, with earthly political systems. And we're going to start in Acts. Elliot kind of finished up the New Testament for us last time. Appreciate that. So the book of Acts took place roughly the year 30 AD to 60 AD. Right? Jesus lived roughly zero. It's not exactly that, but 0 to 30 AD is roughly when Jesus was alive. And the book of Acts takes place roughly from 30 AD to 60 AD. The early church had a very Jewish character, very Jewish core. All 12 of the disciples were Jews. The leaders of the early church were Jews. Paul was a Jew. And so Christians first met in synagogues. Paul always went to the synagogue first when he went to a new city, even in a Greek area. So the influence of Greek culture was very, very strong in Roman society, even though politically things had, the Romans had conquered the Greeks, and it was a Roman government, but Greek culture was still very strong, Greek religion. So you had a strong Greek culture, but the dominant Roman Empire. But the trouble that the early church faced were largely not from the Roman Empire. The most severe trouble that they initially faced in the book of Acts was usually persecution from the Jewish religious leaders, the Jewish establishment. That really became intense in 36 AD with the stoning of Stephen. You all know the story of Paul, who was present at the stoning of Stephen and then later converted. Christians, this is actually tangential to the book of James that we're going through. James was the leader of the early church in Jerusalem. James and Peter were the two pillars of the church. The same James whose book we're studying right now, James, the brother of Jesus. So, but many of the Christians who were living in Jerusalem were scattered, were driven out of Jerusalem by Jewish persecution. Many of them went to Antioch. Antioch is in present-day Syria. It's 100 and some miles north of Jerusalem. And Antioch became the new center of gravity for the church. Paul and Barnabas were sent on their missionary journeys out of Antioch from the church there. So one big question that the early church was wrestling with was the relationship between Christianity, the relationship between the church, and its relationship to the Jewish faith, right? And one big political question that people were wrestling with was, are Christians considered Jews or are they not considered Jews? Because this was so critical for them, because Rome demanded worship of the emperor. By this point in time, Caesar was claiming to be a god, right? He was claiming to be divine. And so part of being a good citizen meant that you had to worship the actual person of Caesar. Everybody in the empire had to do this, except one particular little group was granted an exception to this rule, and that was the Jews, because the Jews, it was so odious to the Jews to worship another god, right? For most people in Greek and Roman society, it was no big deal to worship 10 gods or 100 gods. Polytheism was, you could just add another god. They wouldn't have even had trouble adding the worship of Jehovah God, but for the Jews, that was not an option to just worship as many gods as you wanted, or to pay a pinch of incense to the emperor. So the Jews were granted, because the Jews were such a thorn in the side of Rome, they were granted an exception to keep them revolting. So a big question was, are the Christians also going to receive this legal loophole, this legal exemption from Rome? And that actually was a really important part of the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. It's just interesting, some of the cross-pollination from this class to the morning sermon. Paul and James met each other probably on 3 different occasions, and the most significant meeting between the two of them, because Paul was stationed in Antioch, James was in Jerusalem. The most significant meeting between them was the Jerusalem Council of talked about in Acts 15 and Galatians 2. And they did work out the perceived differences. They came together and realized, no, we are preaching the same gospel. It's the same Jesus, it's the same faith, and they worked out those differences. And the Jerusalem Council took place in 50 AD, so roughly 20 years after Jesus' ascension. But if you'll recall in Acts 15, the big controversy in Acts 15 was, do Christians need to become Jews? Do they need to be circumcised? Do they need to keep the ceremonial laws or not? And that had to be hashed out, and you can read about that in Acts 15 or Galatians 2. Thoughts on this? We're kind of rushing forward quickly. What?
This had to be political, and this might be a silly question, but while Zeke was talking about James this morning and getting on the airplane,
Mm-hmm.
I Googled up how James died. I wasn't sure about that. I knew he was killed,
Mm-hmm.
but I wasn't aware of he was stoned by the Pharisees.
Yeah.
So,
And he was one of the first. Stephen was the first martyr, I think. But James was not too long after that. The book of James was written very early relative to the other epistles because James didn't live much longer after he wrote it.
I see. So it was even dated, if you can trust Google, but 62 or 69 AD, they had the 2 dates in there.
Okay.
But it would have been political, right? For the Jews to actually murder?
Yeah. Of course, politics is involved in everything, right? The Jews didn't actually have the political authority to execute someone, but it's like a lot of countries around the world, the law is enforced unevenly at different times and places, right? And so it seems like at the time of Jesus, the Jews had to go to Pilate to get permission. They wanted to kill Jesus, but they had to go to Pilate to get permission to kill Jesus. They didn't seem to do that for Stephen or for many Christians later on. So most people think that's just a difference in, depending on who the governor was, the Roman law was enforced more strictly or less strictly. And sometimes the Jews felt like they had enough, the Jewish religious leaders, I should say, sometimes they felt like they had enough leeway to just execute people themselves. Other times they had to go get permission from the Romans to do that. So, but yes, James was one of the earlier church leaders who was executed. Yeah, and it would have been extrajudicial. In other words, maybe they got the permission of the Romans. I guess it's not. Acts doesn't tell us about that. So, yeah, other thoughts. We'll keep it moving. So I was going to put these in bullets that come out one at a time. But so here was one of the big questions politically that Christians were wrestling with. So new Christians, they taught that Jesus is Lord, not Caesar, right? And that was a threat to Caesar because Caesar wanted everybody to believe that he was a god and worthy of being worshipped. Christian says we can't do that. And so one thing that developed is Christians came to be seen as bad citizens of Rome, as unpatriotic, not good supporters of the government. Because, as Paul wrote, there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, there's no male or female, you're all one in Christ Jesus. And the teachings of Paul, along with the teaching of Jesus in Matthew, I think it's Matthew 17, where he says, render to God what is God's and render to Caesar what is Caesar's. They were creating a division between God and the emperor, right? The true God and the emperor are not the same person, right? In the Roman world, if you support the emperor, you're going to support Rome. If you support Rome, you're going to support the emperor. The worship of the emperor and the being a good citizen were not two separate things. They were one thing. And Jesus said, Jesus separated out citizenship from heaven with citizenship on earth. And so this was a really a new thing, right? Because all human societies up to that point had no separation between church and state, right? The worship of your gods went right along with being a good citizen of your nation, because it's the gods who provide you rain, who provide you fertility, who make your crops grow. And so if you're not worshiping the gods, what happens? The gods get angry, and the gods stop sending us rain, and they stop sending us fertility, and then we start losing in war. And so if you don't worship the gods, you are a bad citizen. You're an unpatriotic, you're a bad citizen. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so Christians came along and they said, sorry, we can't worship the emperor. We can't do that. We'll try to be good citizens of Rome. We'll try to love our neighbors, but we can't worship the emperor because Jesus is king and the emperor is not, right? And so the church says worship of God has to trump or take precedence over worship of the emperor or the nation. And something new entered the world politically at this point in time, which was this sense of a worldwide body of people, the church, that actually transcended national boundaries. It transcended race. It transcended nationality and race. And this was a new thing. It was always assumed you are a citizen of your country and your first loyalty was to your country, and everybody else outside your country is a potential enemy. They might be a potential ally, but you're going to look at them first as a potential threat. And so the church was the world's first international association that transcended all borders and boundaries. That was a new thing in the world. Does that make sense? It's hard for us to unthink. Transcend means that's a good question. Transcend means it takes precedent over. It reaches beyond just the boundaries of my country. So to give you an example, I have a kinship, I have a union with my black brother in Africa, or a Chinese brother or sister in Christ in China, that is actually more fundamental than my relationship to my next door neighbor in Archer, right? That was a new thing in the world politically, that there was this worldwide body that connected me to other believers across boundaries. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes more sense. Yeah.
It's hard for we think of the world today as sort of a.
So you can reach out everywhere.
Right. Yep. That's right. Yeah. So I can go to Kenya and work with brothers and sisters in Christ there, and we have an immediate bond in Christ that I don't necessarily have with my next door neighbor here, right? And so that's a real thing, and it was new in the world, and it was a new political thing. Does that make sense? It's hard to unthink that because we kind of think of in terms of a global village today. We think everybody human rights, but that transcend national boundaries. But that wasn't always the case. That came from the specific teaching of Jesus and the New Testament church. Does that make sense?
So what if some of the Jews then, when they had a discussion of render to Caesar's, what belongs to Caesar, did some feel like if they paid taxes, that was actually worshiping Caesar? If they paid taxes?
Well, there's two different times in the Gospels that Jesus encourages the paying of taxes. One is Matthew 17, when he says, the Pharisees are coming to trip him up, right? And they say, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Because there would have been a political controversy within Judaism, should we be paying taxes to the emperor or not? And actually the Pharisees were more, the Sadducees were the most wedded to Rome. They were considered kind of sellouts particularly by the Zealots. The Pharisees were probably somewhere in the middle. Like, the Zealots who were hardcore they were willing to die to take down Rome. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you had the Sadducees who were like completely ingrained in a way that was sort of sold out to Rome. And the Pharisees were trying to probably exist somewhere in the middle, where they were trying to be faithful to the law, but they also knew where their bread was buttered in terms of Rome. But there was a lot of controversies within Judaism as to how do we respond to. They all would have thought the universe will not be right until the king, the Messiah, reigns from Jerusalem, right? And the Romans are put in their place under our feet. But there were different groups in Judaism that were more or less more compromised to the Romans or more antagonistic to the Romans. And so that when they came to Jesus with this question, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not, they were wanting him to pick a side in a hostile debate so that he could get hammered from one side or the other, or from Rome, right? And then there's another example in the Gospels, I don't remember the chapter, where the tax collectors come to Jesus' disciples, and Jesus sends them out to catch a fish, and there's and they pay the taxes, right? But what's that? That was the temple tax. But I think it was still required to be able to raise taxes. They still had to have to raise taxes independently from Rome. They had to have permission from Rome, and Herod was he was as compromised of a person as you could get. He was Jewish, but he was completely, he knew where his bread was buttered, right? So it was all kind of a messy entanglement, right?
One of the things when Jesus was on trial for his life, it was said to the religious leaders, is he the king of the Jews? We have no king but Caesar.
That's
It's as ironic as the high priest saying, better that one man die for me.
right.
Just
Right.
ridiculously ironic.
It's one of the most ironic statements in the New Testament, is for them to say, we have no king but Caesar, because they hated Caesar, right? They were willing to unite with Caesar because they hated Jesus even more. So Christians dealt with this tension because Rome was accusing them of being bad citizens. Christians really did want to seek the good of society, right? This goes back to Jeremiah 29, right? they did want to seek the good of their neighbors and their nation, but they couldn't pledge their ultimate allegiance to Rome in the way that other Roman citizens did. And so this made them suspect in the eyes of their Roman neighbors. Does that make sense?
What suspect?
Suspicious. Their Roman neighbors were suspicious of them because they weren't all the way in on worshiping Rome and Rome's gods and Rome's emperor.
So could they then go ahead and assassinate those people that didn't?
Yes, yeah, and she asked, could Rome assassinate Christians for their failure to worship the emperor? Yes, and they did. The 300 years between Jesus and Constantine, we'll talk about Constantine probably next week, was a period of uneven persecution, sometimes very intense, sometimes less intense, but there was always an undercurrent of resistance on the part of Rome to the church, right? Sometimes it was very intense, other times not as intense, but it was always unpopular to be a Christian in Rome for these reasons. So now we're jumping forward 1700 years in time because I want to point out that this tension is not it wasn't unique to that time period. So this is Rousseau, who lived in the 1700s. He was one of the leaders of the Enlightenment. He was French, and one of the leaders of the thought leaders of the French Revolution. He did not like Christians. And one of the reasons he specifically did not like Christians, I'll let you read his words. He says, far from winning the hearts of citizens for the state or the government, he says Christianity removes them from it, from loyalty to the government, as from all earthly things. He says nothing is more actively opposed to the social spirit than Christianity. This is his take. He says Jesus came to set up a spiritual kingdom on earth. Thereby the theological system was separated from the political system. In other words, people are worshiping this other God. They're not worshiping the gods that support our state, right? So the theological system was separated from the political system, and the state ceased to be one state. So in other words, the nation, the government, now has all of these people in it who have loyalties somewhere else. Their primary loyalty is not to our nation. He thought that was a bad thing. He says inherent tensions emerged which have never ceased. The effect of Christianity is that men now have two legislations. In other words, God's law and man's law. They have two sovereigns, right? Our earthly king and the heavenly king. We have two native lands, this country and our home in heaven. He was saying that Christians cannot be good Christians and good citizens. That was his critique. Well, how would you answer this?
Thanks for the compliment.
Yeah. Yeah, what do you think about this critique? Is it true? Is it not true? Is it fair? Is it unfair? What do you think about this critique? It's the same essential critique that the Romans were making against Christians. That's why I bring it up.
What was actually they were believing in when they were believing in
The Romans?
the Romans?
Yeah, so the Greeks and Romans had lots and lots of local gods, small g gods, right?
Okay.
And those gods were responsible, some of them for making the crops grow, or some of them were responsible for wheat, some of them were responsible for the grape harvest, some of them were responsible for rain. So if you worship the gods and keep them happy, then they will keep providing you the things that you need, right? And if you don't worship the gods, you make them angry, they're going to stop giving us what we need, and it's going to be bad for our country, right?
To me, it looks like he forgot to read the statements that Jesus made about submitting to those in authority.
Mm-hmm. I think he is missing that piece. Yeah.
Gifts of the Spirit against things there is no law
Mm-hmm.
makes us great citizens.
Right.
Should.
Right. Right.
But I would say that the church, in certain periods of time, really did pull out
Mm-hmm.
of society.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're still have really strong elements of that today.
Mm-hmm. We're still trying to figure out that tension between our earthly citizenship and our heavenly citizenship. Yeah.
Right. Right, and I think that has probably hurt our witness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there have been times when, exactly, to go, well, at this point in time, you had Christians living in catacombs because they had to live in catacombs to survive. But in other times, you had, one example that people point to is kind of the first half of the 1900s, where in the U.S., where Christians were more, let's disengage from politics, let's disengage from society, let's disengage from the leading institutions of the nation and just kind of go into a Christian bubble. And in some ways, we're seeing the fruit of that today, having abandoned most of those institutions, and now we're trying to figure out what does it look like to try to get back into those institutions with influence, right? Yeah,
I
Stacey.
would say we have a different perspective because our country was built on the Bible,
Mhm.
whereas those countries were not built on the Bible.
Mhm.
And so the way it looked then to the people who were in that country when people changed to Christianity, their lives changed differently than the way we expect these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. The only thing I would add to that is what happens if, when America becomes post-Christian, as seems to be the trajectory of things, are Christians once again going to be accused of being bad citizens, not loving their country? Sort of a leading question, but that is happening, right, Chris? Yeah.
I think his statement is true in the case where both kingdoms aren't in agreement,
Yeah.
and that would have been.
That's a very good point. Yeah, if the state is teaching something very different, the government is teaching something very different from the church, then Christians are going to be forced into being bad citizens in the eyes of a lot of people in the state, right? If you have if the state or the government is aligned to biblical principles, then maybe Christians aren't going to have as much tension. But the more that those pull apart, the more the rubber band gets tighter and tighter, right? So now we're jumping back. So this is an actual fragment of a document that survived from 130 AD. This is a letter from one Roman to another. The person receiving I think the letter itself, we don't know who wrote it, but it was addressed to a Roman citizen named Diognetus. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And this is how one Roman is describing Christians to another Roman citizen. I think this is really fascinating. He says, "The Christian dwells each in his native land, but only as resident aliens. They carry out all the tasks of a citizen and endure all the burdens like foreigners." I'll say that again. They carry out all the tasks of a citizen. In other words, doing good things in society, but they endure all the burdens, the hardships, like foreigners. Every foreign land is a native land to them, and every native land is foreign to them. I think that's actually a really beautiful statement of kind of what we're aiming at, right? To be good citizens of our place, and we endure the hardships of our place, and we try to serve and do good in our place. But we also, as Paul says in Philippians 3, we have a citizenship in heaven as well, right?
How would you define being a good citizen?
Yeah. How would you guys answer that question?
I don't know, paying taxes came to my mind, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Abiding by the rules of your local government.
Right, right. Insofar as the local laws of our government are not hostile to God's law, we should try to follow them and be good citizens, right? Yeah. Paying our taxes. We might work to reduce our we might work through appropriate means to address tax law when tax law seems. We just got that in the mail this week, right? Our taxes went up another a lot. So I'm thankful we have people in the state government trying to address those questions of taxation. But Christians aren't fundamentally opposed to paying taxes, right? Other ways that Christians can be involved in being a blessing to society. We have Christian doctors and Christian teachers and Christian firefighters and Christian, everything. If you do your job well, you are contributing to the good of society, right? Whatever your job is, if it's a carpenter or a plumber or a whatever, right? So
I guess the question would be, when would it, relative to Brazil, what would be the warnings that we're crossing over to be too much of a good citizen?
I think that's one of the main questions of this class, right? So what does it look like? How do we know somebody said if the Bible gives you attention and you just cut the band to relieve the tension, you're probably going to be making a strong error in one direction or another, right? If you go all in on this side, then there's no more tension, but you're probably not being faithful. If you go all in on this side, there's no more tension, but you're probably not being faithful, right? As long as we exist as citizens of earth who are also citizens of heaven, we're not going to get rid of that tension, right? It's always going to be there. Chris made a good point. The more the society departs from biblical teaching, the more that tension is going to feel apparent, right? And I think we're all wrestling with that in a sense that we're in a society that the trajectory appears to be away from alignment with biblical principles. We feel that tension increasing, right?
Then from a citizenry conversation, then what can Christians actually, if those things are widening, is there, what is the church responsibility to accept the widening, or relative to being a good citizen, can the church do things to handle that back up? That's where you get into things like politics.
Right.
That leaders truly making decisions. People
Right.
in rooms are truly making decisions.
Right.
I talked to a group of collegiate kids on Thursday, and it's like, it doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
People literally make decisions around tables like this.
Right.
And if the Christians aren't at the table,
Right.
that will automatically.
Right. A society is a very complex thing with lots of layers, right? And we need Christians at every layer. We need Christians in national government and in state government and in education. Education is a huge one that, I think someone said that teachers' colleges today are like 99% left-leaning liberal, right? And that's a massive problem culturally, right? We have good Christian teachers teaching in our local public schools, for which I'm very thankful. And we have homeschoolers and we have Christian school. And at all levels, Christians are needed who are doing their best to be faithful to Christ in the context where they are. But so I listened to something recently. The Christians in the period we're talking about, the first 300 years of the church, they were mostly just trying to survive and stay faithful in a really difficult climate. They probably didn't have a grand strategy for how can we seize the levers of Rome? How can we seize the levers of power in the empire and steer this big ship in another direction? We're going to talk about this next week. God did something crazy that nobody expected, which is one of the emperors in the early 300s named Constantine converted to Christianity and said, our whole society, no longer are Christians going to be persecuted, they're actually going to be upheld and celebrated. That was overnight. It would be like if communist China or North Korea overnight, Xi Jinping became a Christian and said, now we're going to be... Nobody planned that, right? No, this wasn't a committee in the catacombs who said, hey, we're going to have an evangelism campaign and get the emperor saved. Nobody saw that coming. I would argue God did that in his sovereignty. Now, it made things complicated in a whole different way for the church that we're going to talk about next week. It presented a whole different set of challenges. But that wasn't a committee of church leadership that made that happen. And so someone said Ecclesiastes is a great political book because what Christians were at this time period were trying to do was just be faithful and survive. And then God did this completely unexpected thing that totally upset the apple cart and brought them a whole different set of challenges. They didn't make that happen, right? They didn't have a plan for that happening. So sometimes God is going to do stuff that is just like, wow, I did not see that coming at all. And living faithfully, so in some ways, it's what Solomon's advice, right, is love God and do good work and fear God. And this is sometimes the best you can do, right? You're trying to raise a family and you're trying to be a good neighbor and you're just trying to be faithful where you are. And maybe you feel like, I don't have any access to the halls of power in Washington or Rome. Again, I don't think we should run away from those things. I think we should seek influence as a way of loving our neighbor and loving our society. But it won't always be possible. Some eras it will be more possible than others. And many of those things are not actually in our control, right?
Yeah, if you were to talk with Evan,
Mm-hmm.
is it Evan?
Mhm.
from Bangladesh.
In Bangladesh, yeah.
He's
He's just trying to survive.
He's just trying to survive.
Right, right,
And now he's trying to
right.
probably fight for his faith as he's healing from
Right, getting beat up, right,
being severely abused.
right,
Yeah.
right, right. Yeah, so it is, the tension is real and it's not ever going away, right?
I heard a statistic this week that grieves me, and kind of expanding on what Mark, taking on maybe a little bit step further, it was kind of when it comes to Christian responsibilities. But the statistic I heard this week that the condition of our country, elections have consequences, that 40% of the Christians don't vote.
Mm.
They're not registered to vote.
Mm.
So if you think of it in that manner, and you look in this room, I don't know how many's in this room, 60 maybe? That's a great deal of that statistic would you call that complacency? Or who's the failure? Is it the nuclear family? Because I know my nuclear family, going clear back to my grandfather, you need to vote, kid.
Right.
So is it the nuclear family? Is it the school system? Where is the failure there? Or is it just complacency? And if we pin it to that word, preaching the gospel and complacency in the church, and that's going to happen.
Yeah,
That's going to happen.
yeah,
And so I put a challenge to you pastors. You keep preaching. You keep preaching and teaching so we don't come to that complacency.
yeah, and it's sort of related to James this morning, right? Like, James says you can't only live in a little spiritual realm and not actually, it's not a biblical option on the menu to say, I'm just going to have a little spiritual place in my heart, but I'm not going to worry about anything in the world, right? He said our faith and our life in the world have to be connected, right? And I think politics is one of a number of areas where our faith needs to be connected to our life in the world. And so, yeah, I think Christians, I don't know the reasons why some people choose not to vote, if they just throw up their hands or if they think it doesn't matter, but we have the privilege of voting and we should vote. We have the privilege of, if we have the ability to run for office, I think that's a good thing. If we have the ability to serve in a lobbyist organization, that's a good thing. We should seek influence for good, all the while knowing that I'm one person and God is sovereign and God's going to do what he's going to do, right? Yeah,
Back
Chris.
to Constantine and the work that God did in him, didn't he probably work through a Christian that was living their faith out in front of Constantine, even though it was a dangerous thing to do?
Yeah, there were, we know, because we have some surviving documents, that there were, it was usually women, but there were some women pretty high placed in the empire, in the Roman Empire, who became believers and probably taught some of these boys in the Christian faith, because it doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? How do people choose unless they've heard, right? And so, yeah, there's probably moms in here who think, what good am I doing? I'm just doing dishes and laundry day after day, and what good is it doing? But raising children is a political act if you're raising them in faithfulness, because who's going to be making the decisions of our country in the future? These children are going to grow up, right? And yeah. Good. I appreciate you guys' interaction with this. So I stumbled across this recently. I thought this was interesting. In the about 100 years ago in America, it was sort of when liberal Protestantism, you know what I mean by liberal Protestantism? There was this split between Christians who took the Bible seriously as authority for life, versus liberal Protestants who were like, we can keep the nice teachings of Jesus, but we don't really want all that stuff about sin and hell, and they're nice suggestions, and Jesus was a nice person. Liberal Protestants in around the turn of the century were making a critique against mostly Catholic immigrants who were coming from Europe, and they were saying, we don't like these people coming in because their first allegiance is to the church rather than to the nation. And I think, well, like you said earlier, Buck, I think that's a compliment. Right? I would like to have that said about me, that my first allegiance is to Christ, and I love my nation, right? Because this is the nation God gave me, and I'm thankful for it, and I love America, and I want it to thrive. But ultimately, at the end of the day, my first allegiance is to Jesus, the King, and my first family is the church, right? Not the nation or not my race. Does that make sense?
Nathan,
Yeah.
I don't think you can appreciate your country like it is when you're away from it.
That's
When I was away from it, July the 4th, we had this picnic over in Papua New Guinea, and everybody's waiting. I said, "Oh, I wish I were in the land of cotton, no thunder, no rubber." And everybody went, "Dear me." But it just
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love America.
Yeah.
I love the South. I love my traditions.
Right.
You know.
Every time we would come through customs back into the U.S., you see the flag,
Yeah.
and you're like, oh,
And you've never been away. You don't realize what we have.
Right. And I think so. Not everybody can go live in a island on the other side of the world for 30 years. But when you do that, I think it does two things. It gives you a new kind of appreciation for America, but it also gives you at the same time maybe eyes to be able to see some of the critiques, changes and critiques that maybe the church is like the frog in the pot slowly boil, So if you're Leslie Newbigin, he was a British missionary who went and lived in India for 50 years, early, 1920 to 1960 or something, 70, something like that. And he said the church needs missionaries because they can go away and then they can come back and see things with fresh eyes and see critiques that the church sometimes needs because they stepped out of the stream for 40 years and then stepped back in and can see the differences more starkly. But what you said too, we would get emotional every time we came through customs, and we're very, very thankful for our country, right? Well, I think we'll get into this later. G.K. Chesterton, he was a British guy who lived early 1900s, strong Christian. He came out against the Boer War. So England invaded South Africa and went to war against the Dutch, the Boers. And he was a newspaper man. He came out publicly against the Boer War. He thought it was just a greedy land grab. And he got accused of being a bad citizen, a bad patriot. And his response to that was, someone asked him to define what is true patriotism, what is true love for your country. Does it mean just unqualified support for whatever they do? And he said, no. Anyone who says, I support my country right or wrong, is like a man who says, I support my mother drunk or sober. Right? Like if you really love your mother You're going to resist her when she needs to be resisted because you love her, right? If she has a problem, you're going to, because you love her, you're going to stand against her, right? At times. You're going to be against her because ultimately you're for her. And I think that's a good definition of patriotism for believers. We don't support whatever our country does. Sometimes we have to resist what our country does because we love our country, right? So Acts, the book of Acts ends roughly early 60s AD. So from 60 AD to 70 AD, a lot of stuff politically was happening in Rome. When you read the book of Acts, you see a fairly decent relationship between the early church and the Roman government. Largely you see that in terms of how Paul often takes shelter from Jewish persecution under Roman law, right? So it's the Jews who have a plot to kill Paul when he's in Jerusalem, and he flees to the Roman governor and says, hey, I want to go on trial, right? Put me on trial to Rome. And so he gets a all expenses paid trip to Rome on behalf of the Roman government for a trial. But the reason he claimed that was because he knew he was going to get killed otherwise, right? So Rome is often portrayed as sheltering Christians during the book of Acts from Jewish persecution. That all begins to change, particularly after the Emperor Nero. We've talked about Nero before, but Nero was a psychotic, bad person. And he was increasingly going insane, probably. Rome caught on fire, the city of Rome caught on fire in 64 AD, burned a large portion of the city. Some people think he set the fire. Probably won't ever know for sure. But Nero was of course, Nero was under political pressure for letting this fire happen, right? And so he was looking for a scapegoat, and the convenient scapegoat he found was he spread the rumor that Christians had set the fire. And people easily believed that rumor because they already didn't like Christians very much for the reasons we've already talked about, right? So Rome begins to take a much more hostile position toward the church beginning in the mid-60s AD. And again, we mentioned this, but Christians already had failed to join in the worship of Roman gods. Gods are going to be angry at Rome, so Christians are bad citizens. And this was a perennial accusation against Christians. And I would argue it's an accusation against Christians today, right? Well, do we have gods in America or in the modern West? Small g gods, yes. Every society that ever has lived has gods. So what are our gods in America? Choice.
Celebrate the fact that there's an opportunity for a choice, not that a good choice was
Yeah,
made.
yeah. Absolute human autonomy, absolute freedom. So how are Christians in standing against that? How are we bad citizens?
We believe there's such a thing as a good choice and a bad choice. So.
Right. Yeah, so Christians today, if they're trying to stand athwart the sexual revolution, which is ultimately, the sexual revolution is a god, a modern Western god. And to the extent that we try to stand against that, we are often thought to be anti-human, right? Bad citizens, we're mean, right? That's a real thing. Right? It's framed in moral terms. That they won't admit to being a religious conflict, but it is a religious conflict, right? Peter and Paul are both executed by Rome in the mid-60s under Nero. Most of the 11 of the 12 apostles are executed right around this time. Again, the emperor said just once a year, just come and pay a pinch of incense to the emperor. The Christians said, we can't do that. This is also economic, right? Because there were guilds, trade guilds. So if you were a sandal maker, you had a guild of sandal makers, and there was a god of your guild. And if you didn't offer sacrifices to the god of the sandal guild, you probably got kicked out of the sandal guild. And so there were real economic pressures. And again, in the West, as these things continue to go in separate directions, there are going to be medical guilds and educational guilds and things that are going to increasingly, this is happening in Canada. There's the one evangelical college in Canada that was able to issue law degrees can no longer issue law degrees. That's been taken away from them by the Canada government. So there are economic penalties that increase when society is pulling farther and farther in the opposite direction, right? There were lots of slanderous reports about Christians. There were slanderous rumors about about cannibalism. Why would Christians be accused of cannibalism?
Eat my body and drink my blood.
Right. They were accused of their love feasts of being, which I don't know why the Romans had a problem with that. They seem to like that kind of thing. But anyway, Chesterton said, any stick will do when it comes time to beat. It's not that they're wrong about, they'll get accused of opposite things, but it's not that, any stick will do, right? Is that music playing over there yet? Interestingly enough, Rome was politically a pretty relatively stable, very prosperous place at this time. Historians call this the golden era of Rome. I've heard economists say this was perhaps the wealthiest time in world history until the modern era, because the Romans had this system of roads. They policed the seas, so there wasn't piracy everywhere. There wasn't criminality on the roads. You could travel around and not get waylaid by criminals all the time. And so there was a great increase in trade, and this led to a lot of wealth generated in Rome and its provinces. The Colosseum was built during this period. It was built, I believe, by the Emperor Vespasian, who was the one who conquered Jerusalem in 70 AD. So many of the most famous buildings that still stand today were built during this very wealthy period of Rome. But there was a price, right? This was, so Tacitus was a Roman historian who was pro-Roman, but occasionally, just in quoting Rome's, the victims of Rome's conquests, you get a little taste of what it was like if you weren't on the winning side. He was quoting one of Rome's conquered enemies, and he says that the enemy who was conquered says this: the Romans, after exhausting the land by their devastations, are now rifling the oceans. To ravage, to slaughter, to usurp under false titles, they call empire, and where they make a desert, they call it peace. So we talk about the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, but it was purchased with an awful lot of violence, right? With an awful lot of blood.
It still was never a good time to be a Roman woman or child.
Correct. Right.
Only men.
We'll get into that more next week, yeah. we're out of time. So this is a good place to stop. 70 AD, we'll come back to this next week, the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome. So, Chris, would you close us in prayer?